Sign
She
these
thought she was
papers.
living
It's
her
over.
dream until the truth turned it into a nightmare. Everything seemed perfect.
How can you be
Love,
so
trust,
cruel?
a future carefully built piece by piece. But behind the calm surface, deception was growing, waiting for the right moment to break through. And when it finally does, it shatters everything she believed in.
Congratulations, we've
Yet in
finalized
that
the
moment of
adoption
pain,
papers.
something powerful is born. Because she refuses to stay broken. She rises, stronger, fearless, and ready to take back control of her life. What was meant to destroy her becomes the very thing that makes her unstoppable. The lesson? Sometimes life reveals the truth in the most painful ways, but that truth sets you free. Strength isn't about avoiding the fall, it's about how you rise after. And the moment you choose yourself, you take your power back. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to continue creating more powerful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
Marcus timed the ambush for the moment of peak vulnerability. His wife, Chloe, 8 months pregnant and draped in mourning clothes, was accepting hushed condolences in the grand library of her childhood home following her father's funeral. As she dabbed at her eyes, he guided her away from the small crowd of academics and toward a secluded sitting room. It was there, standing beside her father's favorite reading chair, that he dropped the bombshell. He told her their life was a suffocating bore. He said his new partner, a vibrant social media influencer, offered a future Chloe never could. He coldly reminded her that she'd abandoned her career for him, had zero independent wealth, and was now utterly alone. With that, he turned, walked out the front door, and climbed into a waiting chauffeured sedan that disappeared into the Boston traffic. He never looked back. He left her standing there, a ghost in her own father's house, her hands instinctively shielding her unborn child as the sound of her own shattering heartbreak filled the void. Marcus was sure he had won, that he had broken Chloe so completely she would simply fade away. But Marcus, in his limitless arrogance, had no idea that the quiet history professor in the casket, the man he'd patronizingly called a dusty academic, had spent a lifetime curating a collection of rare manuscripts worth over $800 million. And every single page now belonged to Chloe. This is a story of calculated cruelty and blinding greed. It's a tale of a man who threw away a priceless gem for a piece of glitter, and the woman who rebuilt herself from the ashes, becoming more powerful than he could ever imagine. Stay with us, because the moment Marcus finds out the truth is one you absolutely cannot miss. This story contains a lesson we believe is essential for everyone. Your worth is never determined by someone else's inability to see it. The people who leave are not taking anything from you. They are simply losing their claim to the incredible person you are. Sometimes, the ultimate victory isn't about revenge, but about creating a life so rich with purpose, success, and joy that the person who tried to destroy you becomes an irrelevant footnote. If that message speaks to you, please hit the like button. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story that will remind you of your own hidden strength. Marcus was certain his wife would crumble. He had envisioned it from the comfort of his high-rise office, picturing Chloe's complete and utter breakdown. And he felt a profound sense of relief. No guilt, no sadness, and certainly no lingering affection. He had observed her at the memorial service, her pregnant form a stark silhouette against the stained glass windows, and his only thought was how deeply tired he was of her. He was tired of her gentle nature, tired of her intellectual conversations, and tired of her unwavering, unconditional love. Today was the day. He had set the plan in motion weeks ago, just waiting for the most opportune moment. Most would consider a funeral the most monstrous time to end a marriage, but Marcus saw it as strategic. Chloe was already at rock bottom. Her father, her hero, was gone. She was emotionally exposed and isolated. She would be too broken to fight, too weak to argue. That's what Marcus wanted. A swift, clean amputation of his old life. No dramatic scenes, no lengthy legal battles, just a quick cut that would leave him free. Hello everyone, and welcome to our channel. Before we go any further, please support us by liking this video and subscribing. We'd also love to know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are you in Dallas, or London, or Melbourne, or Johannesburg? It's always amazing to hear from you. Now, back to the story. The atmosphere in the old Boston chapel was heavy with the scent of lilies and rain, broken only by quiet sniffles. It was a classic New England afternoon, overcast and heavy, the kind of day that feels like the world is holding its breath. A modest crowd of about 70 people had gathered, a mix of old family friends and university colleagues in tweed jackets. Professor Alistair Finch had been a beloved figure, not for his ambition or wealth, but for a deep, scholarly kindness that had touched countless lives. Chloe stood near the front, one hand resting on the swell of her belly. A tiny flutter, a little kick, reminded her that she wasn't entirely alone. The small life inside her felt like a secret promise. I am here, Mom. You are not lost. But Chloe felt lost. She felt terrified. Her father had been her compass, the one person who offered her unwavering support and unconditional pride. When she was a girl, terrified of the shadows in her room, he would read her stories until she fell asleep. When she was a young woman, heartbroken over a college romance, he told her she was a first edition in a world of paperbacks. After she married Marcus and moved into his world of glass and steel, her father had called every single night just to check in. Now that steady, reassuring voice was gone forever, and Chloe felt like she was adrift in a vast, cold ocean. "Are you okay?" her sister Sarah whispered, squeezing her arm gently. Chloe could only manage a faint nod, but she was miles from being okay. She hadn't been okay since the call 3 days ago, informing her that her father had suffered a fatal heart attack in his study. Her eyes searched the crowd for Marcus. He was supposed to be right here, by her side. That's what husbands were for. They held your hand and let you lean on them, but Marcus wasn't beside her. He was standing near the back of the chapel, deep in a hushed, intimate conversation with a woman Chloe had never seen before. He wasn't just scrolling on his phone. His entire posture was angled toward the stranger, his head bent close to hers. He looked completely detached from the funeral, as if it were a minor social obligation he was forced to attend. Chloe whispered his name, Marcus, but her voice was lost in the eulogy. She watched as he touched the woman's arm, and she saw him smile at something she said. A real smile, the kind he hadn't given Chloe in years. He was smiling during her father's memorial service. The dean of the university was at the podium. "We are here today to honor Alistair Finch, a true scholar, a devoted father, and a quiet giant whose intellect was matched only by his compassion." Chloe tried to concentrate, to anchor herself in the moment, but her vision swam with hot tears that spilled down her cheeks. Her hands trembled as she cradled her stomach, feeling the baby kick again, a sharp, insistent jab, as if responding to the sudden surge of ice in its mother's veins. "I'm so sorry, Dad," Chloe breathed, her words too soft for anyone to hear. "I'm so sorry." The service continued. One by one, friends and colleagues shared anecdotes about Alistair Finch. They spoke of his fierce intellect, his quiet generosity, and the fierce, protective love he had for his only daughter. An old friend told a story about how Alistair once spent an entire weekend helping him research a single obscure footnote for a paper. A former student tearfully recalled how Professor Finch had paid for her textbooks one semester when she was broke, asking for nothing in return. Chloe sobbed quietly through it all, and Marcus never came to her. After the final blessing, people formed a line to offer their sympathies. They hugged her gently, murmuring things like, "Your father was a brilliant man, and he was so proud of you, Chloe." She tried to offer a weak smile, but every kind word felt like a fresh wound. Then she saw Marcus walking toward her, and the woman was with him. For a split second, she felt a wave of relief. He's coming to me now. But Marcus wasn't coming to console her. He walked right up to her, his expression unreadable, his beautiful companion a step behind. "Chloe, we need to talk. Now." Chloe's brow furrowed. "Now, Marcus?" People are still here. This isn't the time. It is the time, he said, his voice low and firm. This can't wait. Come with me. The chill in his voice was terrifying. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, more detached. It was the sound of a door being locked for the final time. She let him lead her away from the mourners, back toward her father's house next to the campus. Her shoes felt heavy on the cobblestone path. He didn't take her to the living room where guests were gathering, but to the quiet, book-lined study. It had always been her sanctuary, but now it felt like an interrogation room. Her pulse throbbed in her throat. "What is going on, Marcus?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You're frightening me." He gestured to the woman who had followed them in. "Chloe, this is Isabella." The woman gave her a small, pitying smile. "We need to be honest with you," Marcus said, not a flicker of emotion on his face. "Our marriage is over." The words didn't register. They felt like a foreign language, nonsensical sounds hanging in the air. "What?" Chloe whispered, grabbing the armrest of her father's leather chair for support. "You heard me," he said, his eyes like polished stones. "I'm leaving you. I'm with Isabella now." The room tilted violently. Her free hand shot to her belly, a desperate primal instinct to shield her baby from the impact. "But why?" she choked out, her voice breaking. "Marcus, we're having a child. We're a family. That's the complication, isn't it?" he said, crossing his arms. He looked at Isabella, who stepped forward slightly. "Look, Chloe," Isabella said, her voice smooth but condescending. "We've talked about this. A baby just doesn't fit into the life we're building." The sheer audacity of the woman speaking about her child, about her future, stole Chloe's breath. She stared at Marcus, her eyes pleading. "How can you do this?" she cried, tears of disbelief and agony blurring his face. "How can you stand there and let her say that about your own child? How could you have imagined something so vile?" "I imagine a lot of things, Clara," Marcus said, his voice flat. "I imagine this entire marriage was a profound error in judgment, and I imagine I've been suffocating for years, and I am certain I deserve something more." "Something better," Clara whispered, her voice fracturing. "Better than what, Marcus? Better than me? Better than our daughter?" He tapped the screen of the tablet he'd left on the gleaming quartz countertop. "The separation agreement is there," he announced, his tone as sterile as their minimalist Chicago penthouse. "I've already e-signed it. You just need to add your signature, and we can put this whole mess behind us." Clara stared at the tablet, her hands trembling so hard the light from the screen shimmered. All around them, the city lights twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a view he'd designed. Moments ago, she thought they were just packing for his business trip to Milan. But there was her husband, the man who had promised her a lifetime, serving her divorce papers via a secure link while their unborn child tumbled inside her womb. "Marcus, please!" she begged, reaching for his arm, but he flinched away as if she were diseased. "Not like this. Not before you leave. I'm carrying your child. We are meant to be a family." "You should have thought about that before you lost all ambition," he said, utterly devoid of warmth. "Before what?" Clara's voice climbed, no longer a whisper, echoing slightly in the vast, empty space. "What did I do? Tell me, Marcus, what was my great sin?" "You got comfortable, Clara." His voice was slick with disdain. "You're always tired, always emotional. All you do is write in that little journal of yours. You stop trying. Look at yourself. You've let everything go." "I'm pregnant!" she cried out, the tears finally breaking free. "I am 8 months pregnant with our baby. Of course I'm tired. Of course my body is different. How can you be so incredibly cruel?" "I'm not being cruel," Marcus said, carefully adjusting the cuff of his $1,000 shirt as if closing a deal. "I'm being realistic. I'm not in love with you, Clara. I haven't been for a very long time, and I am done pretending." So Clara instinctively wrapped her arms around her belly, feeling the baby kick in a sudden, agitated burst, as if sensing her panic. The skyline tilted, a wave of dizziness crashing over her. She wanted to scream, to hurl his tablet against the wall, to shatter this cold, perfect nightmare. "Just sign the document," he said. "Let's make this easy on everyone." "No," Clara answered, her voice shaking but laced with a sudden, sharp defiance. "I will not sign it. You don't get to just delete me like an old blueprint." "Whatever," Marcus shrugged, completely unmoved. "We'll see you in court. But trust me, Clara, you don't want that fight. You have nothing. No steady job since you went freelance. No savings, no real assets. That tiny condo your mother left you is practically worthless. You have absolutely nothing, and you will lose." Every single word was a precisely aimed attack. The most painful part was that he was right. Clara had given up her editor position at his request so she could focus on her writing and have a peaceful pregnancy. He had promised he would handle everything. He told her to focus on their new family, and she had trusted him because she loved him, because she believed in their future. "How could you do this?" she choked out, the words getting stuck in her throat. "How can you be this person?" Marcus didn't answer. He checked his phone, a perfect portrait of irritation. "My car is downstairs," he said. "Sign the papers, Clara. It's over." With that, he picked up his briefcase, turned, and walked out the door. He walked down the long, white hallway without looking back, past the abstract art he'd chosen and the staff he employed. He got into the waiting sedan, which slid silently away from the curb and disappeared into the river of city traffic. Clara watched it go, and then her own legs finally failed her. She slid down the wall to the cold marble floor, a solitary figure in a vast, empty home. She held her belly and sobbed, a deep, silent anguish that shook her to her core. Her friend Maya was the first person she managed to call. "Clara, oh my God, what is it? Are you okay? Is the baby coming?" But Clara couldn't speak. All that came out were gasps and sobs as she clutched her stomach, a raw sound of agony escaping her as her beautiful life shattered into a million pieces. Someone from the building's concierge must have called Maya back, terrified Clara was going into labor. Maya was there in 15 minutes, her expression a mixture of rage and deep worry. She helped Clara stand, leading her away from the pristine, cold apartment. Maya drove her to the old Lincoln Park condo, the one she'd inherited from her mother, the one place Marcus had no claim to. He'd always hated it, calling it a cramped antique. Maya helped her inside and onto a faded armchair. She brought her a cup of tea that Clara couldn't drink. She found an old Afghan to put over her that Clara couldn't feel. She spoke soft, reassuring words that Clara couldn't process. Clara just sat there, staring at the textured ceiling of her mother's old home, clutching the sleek, cold tablet that displayed the end of her world. She couldn't understand how a single conversation could erase a decade of love. Her husband was gone. She was 32 weeks pregnant with no real career, no money, and no idea what to do next. In the span of an evening, Clara Vance had lost her entire life, or so she believed. For the next week, Clara existed in a deep fog. She only ate when Maya sat beside her, coaxing her with small bites of toast. She only slept when her body finally surrendered to exhaustion. She ignored her phone, which pinged endlessly with emails from Marcus's lawyer, a woman with a curt tone, asking if she'd reviewed the agreement. She would sit in her mother's old writing nook, surrounded by overflowing bookshelves that still smelled of old paper and ink, and just stare out the window. The condo was utterly quiet. No husband's keys in the door, no confident footsteps on the floor, nothing but the hum of the old refrigerator. The tablet remained on the coffee table, its dark screen a constant silent accusation. Every time her eyes fell on it, she felt a new surge of hopelessness. Signing would be the ultimate surrender. It would mean her marriage, her family, her future were all officially terminated. Maya came by every day, bringing food and a fierce, protective spirit. "You have to eat," she would command. "That little girl in there needs her mother to be strong." Clara would force down a few bites to placate her before her throat closed up again. At night, she'd lie in her mother's bed and talk to her daughter. "I'm so sorry," she'd whisper into the dark, her hands cradling her belly. "I am so sorry your father decided he didn't want us, but I swear to you, my darling, I will be enough. I will never, ever let you down. The baby would shift, a slow, powerful roll, and Clara would cry until she drifted into a restless sleep. Then, one Friday afternoon, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Clara almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was another pressure tactic from Marcus's legal team. But something made her answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice scratchy from lack of use. "Am I speaking with Clara Vance?" a woman asked. Her voice was warm, academic, and gentle. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Dr. Evelyn Reed. I am a literary historian. I was a close colleague of your mother, Helen Vance. I was on a sabbatical abroad and only just heard of her passing." "I am so deeply sorry for your loss, my dear." Clara felt a familiar sting in her eyes. "Thank you," she managed. "Miss Vance," she went on, "I know this is terribly forward of me, but I was hoping I might be able to visit her apartment. There are some materials related to her work that I believe are of immense importance." Clara was confused. "Her work? My mother was an English teacher. She just wrote poetry for herself. It was just a hobby." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then Dr. Reed spoke again, her voice very soft. "Clara, please, I need to see her study. This is truly significant." Something in her tone, a quiet conviction that pierced through her haze of misery, made her agree. She gave her the address. She offered to come by the following morning. This wasn't a lawyer from a downtown firm. This was someone coming to her home. A small flicker of nervous energy stirred in her stomach. Why would a literary historian be so interested in her mother, a woman who lived a quiet life and never published a single poem? For the first time in days, she took a shower. She put on a soft, simple maternity sweater and leggings and tried to comb the knots from her hair. She avoided looking at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. What was the use? She arrived at exactly 10 a.m. Dr. Evelyn Reed was a woman in her late 70s, dressed in a simple but elegant pantsuit, with eyes that shone with sharp intelligence and empathy. She looked around the small, book-filled living room, not at the dust, but at the stacks of journals and boxes of papers. A gentle smile formed on her lips. "You must be Clara," she said, shaking her hand warmly. "You have your mother's spirit in your eyes." She followed her into the small spare room that served as a study, and she audibly gasped. She moved slowly around the space, her gaze drifting over the shelves filled with notebooks and binders. "I haven't seen any of these manuscripts in almost 30 years, she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Helen was so private. After you were born, she just disappeared from the literary scene." Clara followed her, her heart starting to beat a little faster. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said. "Disappeared from what scene?" Leo stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. "Sweetheart," he began, his voice condescending, "your father didn't just dabble in architecture. He was Robert Vance. In the 1980s and 90s, he fundamentally reshaped the San Francisco skyline. His early designs are iconic." He swept a hand toward the glittering cityscape visible from their penthouse window. "He told everyone he'd retired to teach history. No one knew he still held the patents and a controlling interest in the firm." Chloe stared back, the words not quite landing. They were just noise, a language she didn't speak. I don't follow," she whispered. "Your father, Robert Vance," Leo said, his voice sharp with an excitement she found unnerving, "built a portfolio worth a fortune. It's his life's work. It is, and I am not exaggerating, one of the most valuable private architectural portfolios in the country." He looked around the opulent apartment, then back at her, his eyes glittering with a strange new light, as if seeing her for the first time. "Chloe, your ex-husband didn't leave you with a mess. He left you a kingdom. He built a financial tech empire that completely changed online banking. His company is now on the verge of being acquired for over $500 million. Maya's world tilted. She shook her head. "No, that's not possible. My husband was just a coder. We lived in a small apartment in Austin. He drove a 10-year-old sedan. He wore hoodies and jeans. He was just a programmer. That's because he was the most unassuming man I have ever met. His lawyer explained he hated the spotlight. His passion was the work itself. And he wanted you to have a normal life away from the pressures of Silicon Valley, to love him for who he was, not for his net worth. But why wouldn't he tell me? Maya pleaded, her voice breaking with a fresh wave of confusion. Why would he hide his whole world from me? The lawyer took a deep breath. He had his reasons. Maya, very specific reasons about 6 months ago. Your husband finalized the acquisition deal. He was ready to get out of the game, to retire and focus on what mattered most to him, you and your first child. Maya's hand instinctively went to her stomach. Her husband had been ecstatic about the baby. He'd already built a smart crib from scratch for the nursery. When he structured the deal, the lawyer continued, he put the entirety of his founder's shares into a blind trust for you. How much? Maya asked, her voice barely audible. The lawyer opened a sleek leather portfolio and slid a single document across the polished table. Maya looked at the summary page. At the very bottom was a number she had to read it 1 time, 2 times, a 3rd time, before her brain could even process it. $212 million. The room felt like it was shrinking around her. Maya gripped the arms of the chair. That can't be right, she gasped. It is 100% right, the lawyer confirmed. And according to his final wishes, every penny is yours. You are his sole beneficiary, his only heir. Maya felt like the air had been vacuumed from the room. She couldn't breathe. She pressed a hand to her chest, her lungs seizing. Miss Evans, are you okay? The lawyer asked, rising from his chair. Do you need some water? I'm fine, Maya choked out. I don't understand. Why would he hide this from me? The lawyer's expression grew serious. Miss Evans, your husband knew you were considering a divorce. What? Maya looked up, her eyes widening. Your husband was a brilliant reader of people. The lawyer continued. He saw how distant you'd become. He noticed how your old college friend Ethan was suddenly always around, always texting, always steering you toward conversations about how you felt trapped. He heard you on the phone with your sister, telling her you felt you'd married a man with no ambition. Your husband told me, and I quote, Ethan doesn't love Maya. He loves the idea of rescuing her, and he'll convince her my quiet life isn't enough for her. Maya felt a chill creep over her skin. My husband said that yes, he was devastated, but he was worried for you, especially after you told him you were pregnant. He wanted to tell you everything, but he feared that if you left him, Ethan would find a way to get his hands on the money. He was afraid you'd be manipulated and then abandoned with nothing left. Tears streamed down Maya's face. He was trying to protect me. Yes, the lawyer said softly. He made me promise not to reveal the trust until after the acquisition was final. He said that if you still chose to leave, you would need these resources to care for yourself and your child. He wanted to make sure you and his grandchild would be safe for the rest of your lives. Maya finally shattered, she cried, with her whole body raw, agonizing sobs that came from a place of unbearable regret and loss she never knew was there. Her husband had known all along. He had seen Ethan's influence when she had been blind to it, and he had spent his last months building a shield around her, a shield so strong that nothing could ever hurt her or her baby. Oh God, Kevin, she sobbed through her tears. I'm so sorry I didn't see it. I'm so sorry I pushed you away. Maya left the lawyer's office feeling like a ghost occupying her own life. The grief was a physical weight on her shoulders, but underneath it, a new feeling was stirring, something that felt like a fierce, protective fire resolve. She hailed a cab back to the apartment. The draft of the separation agreement Ethan had encouraged her to get was still on the kitchen counter, unsigned. Maya stared at it for a long time, then she picked up her laptop, opened a new document, and began to write. At the top, she typed, The Evans Legacy Rule Number 1. Play the part. Maya thought it through. She could expose Ethan for the opportunist he was. She could tell everyone how he'd manipulated her into believing her loving husband was a failure, but it would just create drama, and stress was the very last thing her baby needed. No, Maya would be smarter. She would be precise. Rule number 2, the fortune stays hidden. This was the most critical part. The lawyer had been clear: if Ethan got a hint of the inheritance before she cut him out of her life for good, he would turn her world into a nightmare. He would fight to stay close, trying to claim his part in her future. The money was her armor. It was her child's security. It had to remain an absolute secret. Rule number 3, the child comes first. Every decision Maya made from now on would serve one purpose: to keep her baby safe, loved, and free from manipulators. Rule number 4, build a fortress. Maya couldn't stay in this city. Every coffee shop held a memory of a life she had misjudged. She needed a fresh start, a new home where she could build a life worthy of her husband's love. She read her list again and felt a feeling that had been gone for months. Power. She was taking back the story of her own life. She picked up her phone and sent a text to the lawyer. "I've made my decision." Maya typed, "I'm cutting him out completely." There was a brief pause before the lawyer replied, "What is your plan?" "I'm going to tell him I've reconciled with my husband, that he'd be a fool to let me go. Then I'm moving away and changing my number. That is an effective strategy." The lawyer texted back. Maya could almost feel the nod of approval in the message. "If you disappear, he has no legal standing to follow or interfere in your child's life." Amelia sent the email with a steady hand. "And one final matter," she typed. "I need to leave the city, Mr. Davies. My father, you said he had other real estate holdings. Is there somewhere I can go that's safe?" The reply came almost instantly. "Your father owned a breathtaking vineyard in Napa Valley. It's over 40 acres, completely private, and exceptionally secure. I can arrange a car to take you there first thing in the morning." "Please do," Amelia wrote back. The following day, Mr. Davies drove Amelia north, out of the city's fog and into the brilliant California sun. They passed through heavy wrought iron gates, the name Vina Amelia elegantly scripted above them, and proceeded down a long driveway lined with ancient olive trees. As they crested a small hill, Amelia's breath caught in her throat. The villa was a masterpiece of Tuscan architecture, its warm stone walls covered in ivy, with a terracotta roof glowing under the sun. A vast terrace overlooked rows upon rows of grapevines that stretched towards the distant mountains. Lavender bushes hummed with bees, a stone fountain trickled into a small pool, and a massive oak tree provided shade near a stone patio. "My father owned all this?" she whispered in disbelief. "He bought it 15 years ago," Mr. Davies explained. "He called it his masterpiece. He wanted it to be a sanctuary for you, a place where his grandchildren could grow up surrounded by beauty and totally protected." Amelia rested her hand on the cool window pane, her eyes tracing the lines of the vines. Gazing at the sun-drenched villa through a blur of tears, she understood that her father had cultivated this place for a life he imagined for her, for the grandchild he was never destined to hold. It was a legacy he never got to share. "I'm staying here," Amelia declared, her voice filled with newfound resolve. "This is where I'll raise my baby." Mr. Davies, her father's trusted attorney, offered a supportive nod. "It was always meant to be yours." Over the next 2 weeks, Amelia poured her energy into awakening the dormant estate. A specialized cleaning crew was hired to meticulously restore the villa's luster. Movers transported the few sentimental pieces from the small apartment she had once shared with her father. She worked with an interior designer to create a nursery that was both calming and enchanting, with walls the color of soft sage and a ceiling painted with a map of the constellations. A beautiful crib carved from reclaimed oak stood as the centerpiece, while shelves were filled with vintage children's books and artisan toys. At the attorney's firm recommendation, she also engaged a premier security company. They installed a sophisticated yet unobtrusive surveillance system that covered the entire grounds, and 2 security professionals were stationed at the front gate around the clock. "No one steps onto this vineyard without your express permission," the head of security promised her. "You and your child will be completely secure." Following his other piece of advice, Amelia also booked an appointment with a psychologist. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Reed, a woman whose compassionate eyes were matched by her direct, no-nonsense approach. "You have endured a catastrophic series of events," Dr. Reed said during their initial session. "The sudden loss of your father, followed by your husband's betrayal during your pregnancy. These are deep emotional wounds that need time and attention to heal." She leaned in, her expression serious but kind. "Reaching out for support is not a sign of failure, Amelia. It's an act of profound strength." Under Dr. Reed's guidance, Amelia began to untangle the knot of pain and anger inside her. She came to understand that the fury she felt toward Julian was not just acceptable, but necessary. She learned that grief was not a straight line, but a wild, unpredictable landscape with days of brilliant sunshine and days of suffocating fog. Crucially, she learned that she did not have to be flawless. She only had to be present and persistent. Bit by bit, day by day, Amelia started to heal. She spent her mornings walking the dirt paths between the rows of grapevines, the air fresh with the scent of earth and fruit. She ate nourishing meals prepared with ingredients from the estate's garden and found her sleep becoming deeper. She spoke to her unborn baby incessantly, a gentle stream of promises and hopes. "We're going to be okay, little one," she would whisper, her hand resting on her stomach as she watched hawks circling over the valley. "We are going to build such a beautiful life for ourselves here, I swear it." And for the first time since her world had shattered, Amelia actually believed it. While Amelia was slowly rebuilding her world, Julian was watching the gilded cage he'd built for himself begin to rust. The illusion he'd chased was proving to be hollow and punishingly expensive. The problems, predictably, started with the finances. Julian sat on a velvet couch in their suite at the Fairmont, glaring at the statement in his hand. $25,000 for a single month. His face burned with a mixture of anger and panic. "This can't be right," he stammered. Isabel, his girlfriend, barely looked up from the mirror where she was fastening a diamond necklace, her bleached blonde hair falling over one eye. "Well, let's see. There's the suite, the private car service, the weekly shopping sprees in Union Square, my standing appointments at the spa, and that private chef we hired for the party last weekend." "Okay, I see the breakdown," Julian interrupted sharply. "We need to scale this back, immediately." Isabel, however, was only interested in scaling up. "Julian, I am so done living out of a hotel," she declared, finally turning to face him, her arms crossed defiantly. "I need a real home. I'm thinking a penthouse in Pacific Heights. It has to have a view of the bridge, a 24-hour concierge, a private fitness center, and a rooftop terrace. You promised me a certain kind of life, didn't you?" "Isabel, a place like that costs a fortune," Julian protested. "And?" she challenged, her voice like ice. "You told me your tech startup was about to change the world. You said you had everything under control. Was that all just empty talk?" "No, of course not." Julian lied, sweat prickling his forehead. The truth was, his startup, once the darling of Silicon Valley investors, was in a death spiral. It was bleeding capital, and the reason was devastatingly simple. Julian had ghosted his own company. He was skipping critical investor calls, ignoring frantic messages from his lead developers, and missing product launch deadlines. He had become so obsessed with Isabel and their flashy, performative lifestyle that he'd neglected the very engine that was supposed to fuel it. One by one, his investors had pulled their funding. With no funding came no salary. And with no salary, there was no way to pay for the five-star hotels, the Michelin-star dinners, the designer clothes, and the constant flow of expensive gifts he used to keep Isabel happy. To compound the disaster, the chic Soma loft he'd shared with Amelia, which he'd planned to sell for a huge and immediate profit, was sitting on a cooling market with zero interest. The real estate agent blamed a downturn in the tech sector. Julian was sure the agent was incompetent. "I just need you to have a little faith in me," Julian begged Isabel. Just give me another month or two, and I'll get everything back on track. Isabel's eyes narrowed dangerously. That's the same thing you said last month. Their fights became more frequent, a toxic nightly routine. Isabel would complain about their temporary living situation. Julian would explode about her relentless spending. She would threaten to leave. He would spin a new web of lies and impossible promises. It was a vicious, downward spiral. One evening, during a particularly nasty argument, Julian's phone buzzed. It was his attorney, Mr. Pierce. "Julian, we have a development we need to discuss," the lawyer said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Amelia has signed the divorce papers." A powerful wave of relief washed over Julian. It was the first bit of positive news he'd had in months. "But she has included several non-negotiable terms," Mr. Pierce continued. "What sort of terms?" Julian asked, the feeling of relief evaporating into dread. "She is demanding full, exclusive legal and physical custody of the child, and she requires you to permanently terminate all parental rights." "Yuck, she can't do that," Julian shouted into the phone. "On the contrary, Julian, she absolutely can," the lawyer replied coolly. "And to be perfectly blunt, you have no leverage to fight her. If you contest this, we'll go to discovery, she will demand child support, and based on the financial statements you sent me, that would be an unmitigated disaster for you." Julian started to argue, but the words died in his throat. His lawyer was right. He was completely insolvent. He couldn't afford a long, messy court battle, and if he were honest with himself, he never wanted the burden of a child. He'd only used the prospect of a custody fight as a weapon to torment Amelia. "Fine," Julian spat, the word laced with venom. "I'll sign." "A sensible choice," Mr. Pierce said. "I will messenger the documents to you in the morning." Julian hung up and stared at the cityscape outside the window. Isabel had been listening from across the suite. "So you're just walking away from the kid?" she asked. "I have no choice," Julian snapped. "What about the child support?" Isabel pressed. "You could have gotten a monthly check out of her." "Amelia doesn't have a cent," Julian said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "Her dad was just some chef with a failing restaurant. He probably left her with nothing but debt. You can't get blood from a stone." Isabel let out a short, sharp laugh filled with pure disdain. "So you incinerated your career and your entire life for nothing? No big sale, no trust fund baby, no income at all. What exactly did you think you were accomplishing, Julian? You," he screamed, his voice cracking, "I blew it all up for you. Because you promised me a future." Amber's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "And what do I have, Liam? I'm living in a glass box in Seattle we can barely afford, with a man whose startup is circling the drain. To be brutally honest, I'm starting to think hitching my wagon to yours was the worst bet I've ever made." The accusation hung in the minimalist apartment, feeling heavier than the perpetual gray sky outside. 2 weeks later, Liam had signed away his parental rights to the baby he'd have with Olivia. The divorce was official. He told himself it was a relief, a clean break, but in the quiet hours of the night, when Amber was asleep and the city lights cast long shadows across the ceiling, his thoughts would drift back to Olivia. He wondered where she'd moved. He wondered how she was managing the pregnancy alone. He wondered, with a sickening lurch in his gut, if he'd just detonated his own life. He tried calling her once, twice, 5 times in a single week. Each attempt was met with the cold finality of her voicemail. "Liv," he said in one message, his voice strained with an emotion he refused to name. "I know I screwed up. I know I hurt you, but I worry about you. And the baby. Please, just send a text. Let me know you're okay." She never did, not once. It was a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the ink on the divorce papers had dried, and Liam was sitting alone in the silent, expensive apartment. He was scrolling through a tech news feed on his laptop, while Amber was at a brunch, likely networking and leveraging the last of their shared credit for social media content. He was skimming headlines about funding rounds and acquisitions, his brain numb, when a name made his finger freeze on the trackpad. Tech pioneer Marcus Thorne. Marcus Thorne. That was Olivia's father's name. But it was a common enough name. It had to be a coincidence. This couldn't be her father. He clicked the link, the article opened, and Liam started to read. The tech world is mourning the unexpected passing of Marcus Thorne, the brilliant but notoriously private founder of Lycosis, one of the foundational software firms of the digital age. But the bigger shock came with the reading of his will, which revealed that Thorne, who lived his life completely out of the public eye, has bequeathed his entire estate, valued at over $900 million, to a single, previously unknown heir. Liam's heart started pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He made himself read on. Sources confirm Thorne sold his controlling stake in Lycosis 3 years ago for a sum believed to be approximately $900 million. He then effectively vanished, opting for a quiet life in a modest home in the suburbs. A modest home, a quiet life. Liam's hands began to shake so badly he could barely hold the laptop steady. According to Thorne's longtime legal counsel, David Chen of Chen and Associates, the entirety of the fortune has been placed in a trust for his only child. Liam felt the air rush out of him in a painful gasp. The heir has now been identified as his daughter, Olivia Thorne, age 29. And then he saw the photo. It was Olivia, but an Olivia he'd never seen before, not the quiet, heartbroken woman he had left behind. This Olivia was radiant. She stood on the steps of a stunning modern building overlooking Lake Union, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, which was tastefully highlighted by a simple, elegant dress. Her hair was styled, her face was glowing, and she had a calm, confident smile that spoke of a deep, unshakable purpose. The caption read, "Olivia Thorne, heir to the $900 million Thorne fortune, outside the New Seattle headquarters of her late father's philanthropic foundation." Liam dropped the laptop. It slammed shut on the coffee table, the image of Olivia's serene, powerful face seared into his mind's eye like a brand. "No," Liam choked out, the word barely a whisper. "No, no, no, this is a mistake. It can't be. $950 million. His ex-wife, the woman he had dismissed as a quiet freelancer, the woman he had cast aside for a flashier model, was worth $950 million. He had divorced one of the biggest tech heiresses in the country. He had signed away his rights to the child of one of the biggest tech heiresses in the country. He had done it without a second thought, almost gleefully. He had practically sprinted out of the lawyer's office feeling clever. Liam shot up from the sofa so quickly he knocked over a floor lamp, which shattered on the polished concrete floor. He didn't even notice. His entire body was vibrating, his vision blurring at the edges. A bitter wave of nausea climbed up his throat. At that exact moment, the apartment door swung open and Amber swept in, balancing several boutique shopping bags. "Liam, you will not believe the sale I found at..." She stopped abruptly when she saw his face. "What happened? You look like you just saw a ghost." Liam couldn't speak. He just stood there, pale and trembling. Amber dropped her bags and hurried over. She saw the laptop, opened it, and read the headline. She scrolled through the article. She saw the picture of Olivia. And then Amber let out a scream. It was a raw, guttural shriek that echoed off the high ceilings of the apartment. $950 million! Amber screamed. "Olivia has $950 million! What came next was the ugliest, most venomous fight they had ever had. For nearly an hour, they tore each other apart. Amber called him the most gullible fool she had ever met. Liam roared back that she was the one who had pushed him to rush the divorce, obsessed with starting their perfect life together. Amber hissed that if she'd had the slightest clue about the money, she would have told him to stay married and just cheat on the side. Liam said that was disgusting. Amber laughed and said he had lost the right to talk about morals the day he walked out on his pregnant wife. They hurled blame and insults back and forth like grenades. But under the rage was a shared, sickening realization. They had gambled everything on their own ambition and had lost in the most spectacular way imaginable. Finally, Liam grabbed his wallet and car keys from the counter. "Where are you going?" Amber demanded. "To find Olivia," Liam said, his jaw tight. "I have to fix this." He drove like a madman, running red lights and swerving through Seattle traffic until he reached the gleaming glass tower that housed the Thorne Foundation. The polished steel doors were locked, and a professional-looking security guard in a suit stepped forward. "I'm here to see Olivia Thorne," Liam said, his voice breathless and strained. "I'm her husband, well, her ex-husband." The security chief at the reception desk glanced at a tablet. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling, you are not on the approved visitor list." Liam's voice rose in panic. He pleaded, his voice cracking, but a second, much larger guard appeared at the chief's side. "Olivia!" Liam yelled toward the ceiling, his voice echoing in the marble lobby. "Olivia, I know you can hear me. I made a mistake. I'm so sorry. I still love you. Olivia, please." His voice was a pathetic, desperate cry swallowed by the lobby's cavernous space. No one answered. The head of security calmly informed him that if he didn't leave, they would have to notify the Seattle Police Department. Liam retreated to his car, defeated. He stared up at the imposing modern tower for 5 long minutes, hoping for some sign that never appeared. What Liam couldn't see was Olivia, watching the entire scene on a security monitor in her office on the 40th floor. She saw his wild gesticulations, heard the distorted sound of his shouting, and felt nothing at all. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even pity. Just a profound, quiet emptiness. She placed a protective hand on her stomach, felt the reassuring flutter of a kick, and closed the monitor. 2 days after being barred from the foundation, Ethan was in his lawyer's office, a desperate plan gleaming in his eyes. "I'm going to fight the divorce agreement," Ethan declared. Mr. Davies just looked at him, unimpressed. "Ethan, you can't challenge a settlement that you orchestrated and insisted upon just because your situation has changed. Why can't I? People change their minds." Mr. Davies took off his glasses, cleaning them with deliberate slowness. "Ethan, if you stand before a judge and claim you want to void your agreement because you saw in an architecture journal that your ex-wife is now the chair of a multi-billion-dollar arts foundation, what do you think happens? What? The judge will laugh you out of court for the most blatant case of fortune hunting she's seen in a decade, and then she'll sanction you for wasting everyone's time." Ethan's face burned with fury, but he forged ahead. "And the baby? I gave up my rights. Can I reverse that? You signed a legally airtight declaration of non-paternity," Mr. Davies said, his voice flat. "You asserted, with zero ambiguity, that you wanted no legal or fatherly connection to that child." "I've had a change of heart," Ethan said through a tight jaw. "The law doesn't operate on your changes of heart," Mr. Davies retorted. "You made a cold, hard calculation." A heavy silence stretched across the office. "I cannot and frankly will not represent you in this," Mr. Davies stated finally. "What you are proposing is morally repulsive, and any judge in this city will see right through it." Ethan stormed out of the office. He hired a different lawyer, a slick operator named Garrett, who had fewer principles and was more than happy to accept his retainer to file for parental rights. They met in a Chicago courtroom 3 weeks later. Olivia walked in with Miss Monroe and 2 associates from a major downtown firm. She wore a chic, deep blue maternity dress, her face calm and composed. She was well into her pregnancy now, nearly 8.5 months along. Ethan showed up with Mr. Garrett in his finest suit, the cuffs just starting to fray. He tried to project confidence, but a knot of ice was forming in his gut. The judge was a woman in her 60s, Judge Miller, with piercing eyes, silver hair pulled into an immaculate chignon, and an expression that said she'd heard every lie a person could invent in her 25 years on the bench. "Mr. Garrett," Judge Miller began, looking at Ethan's lawyer over the top of her glasses, "you are asking this court to grant parental rights for a child that has not yet been born. A child whose own biological father, Your client willingly and emphatically relinquished all parental claims a mere 2 months ago. Please, explain this to me. Mr. Garrett stood. Your Honor, my client, Ethan Holt, has reflected on his past decisions. He now understands that he was acting under immense personal and career-related stress. He loves his unborn child profoundly and wishes to be a supportive and present father. Judge Miller's gaze shifted to Ethan. Mr. Holt, is that an accurate representation? Ethan got to his feet, his pulse pounding in his ears. He'd practiced this speech 100 times in the mirror. Yes, Your Honor, I made a terrible mistake. I was going through an incredibly challenging time in my life, and I wasn't thinking clearly when I signed those papers. But now, with perspective, I realize that being a father to my child is the most important thing in the world to me. It sounded halfway convincing until Olivia's lawyer, Miss Monroe, stood up. Your Honor, if I may? Proceed, Miss Monroe, the judge acknowledged. Your Honor, Mr. Holt's statement is a complete and utter fabrication. He is not motivated by a sudden awakening of paternal feeling. He is motivated by a desire to gain access to my client's family trust and the Sterling Arts Foundation endowment. That is a lie, Ethan yelled. Judge Miller's gavel came down with a sharp crack. Order. Mr. Holt, you will have a turn to speak. Miss Monroe, you may continue. Miss Monroe walked to the bench and gave the judge a thick portfolio. Your Honor, we have compiled considerable evidence that lays bare Mr. Holt's true intentions. Judge Miller opened the portfolio, and as she began to read, her expression hardened. First, Miss Monroe said, we have a series of photographs, time-stamped and verified, taken just 3 days ago. They show Mr. Holt at a champagne bar with his associate, a Miss Sophie Lane. They were celebrating on the very evening my client was holding a memorial for her recently deceased father. Julian felt the ground give way beneath his feet. Second, we have credit card statements confirming Mr. Holt was residing at a luxury hotel with Miss Lane for the entire week of his father-in-law's passing and funeral service. Third, we have signed depositions from 23 different guests who attended Mr. Sterling's memorial at the Art Institute. Each statement recounts the exact same scene, Mr. Holt cornering his pregnant, grieving wife in the gallery named after her own father and handing her divorce papers as she was trying to accept condolences. Witness after witness described Mrs. Sterling becoming physically ill from the sheer shock. Witness after witness confirmed that Mr. Holt then turned and left the memorial without so much as a second look. The courtroom was dead silent. Ethan had a primal urge to simply cease to exist. And finally, Miss Monroe finished, we have Mr. Holt's own notarized declaration from 2 months ago, where he voluntarily surrendered all rights as a parent. In that same document, he went so far as to include a clause casting doubt on the child's paternity, despite having no basis whatsoever to suspect Mrs. Sterling of infidelity. Judge Miller slammed the portfolio shut. She stared straight at Ethan, her eyes as cold as the winter wind off Lake Michigan. Mr. Holt, she said, her voice dangerously quiet, is the information in this portfolio correct? Ethan shot a desperate glance at Mr. Garrett, but his lawyer was statue still, offering no objection, no lifeline, no help at all. I can explain, Ethan managed to stammer. Can you? Judge Miller fired back. Explain to this court why you chose your wife's father's memorial service to serve her with divorce papers. Explain why you insinuated you were not the father of your own child. Explain why you gave up all your parental rights only to reappear 2 months later, the moment you learned of your ex-wife's financial status, suddenly claiming to be a devoted father-to-be. Ethan's mouth opened, but no words came out. Judge Miller nodded, taking his silence as the only confession required. Mr. Holt, I have been on this bench for 25 years. I've seen the very best and the very worst of people, but I have seldom seen a person whose actions so clearly demonstrate that a child's well-being is their absolute last priority. Every single decision you made, from the cruelty at the memorial to this lawsuit filed days after you read about the foundation, points to a single, ugly motive: greed. Your petition for custody is hereby denied with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, I am granting a permanent order of protection. You are to have no contact, direct or otherwise, with Mrs. Sterling or her child. Any violation will result in your immediate arrest and incarceration. Is that understood? Yes, Your Honor, Ethan whispered. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that, Judge Miller snapped. Yes, Your Honor, Ethan choked out, his voice cracking. Mrs. Sterling, Judge Miller said, her tone softening completely to one of warmth and respect. You are awarded sole legal and physical custody from the moment your child is born. Mr. Holt will have no rights, no visitation, and no claim of any kind. This court wishes you and your baby a long, happy, and peaceful life together. Thank you, Your Honor, Olivia replied, her voice steady and clear. Ethan staggered out of the courtroom, his face hot with humiliation. People in the hall looked away, but they had heard. They had heard it all through the open doors. They knew exactly what kind of man he was. 6 weeks later, on a gorgeous spring morning when the cherry blossoms in Lincoln Park were in full bloom, Olivia gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was long and difficult, 14 hours straight, but Olivia found a reserve of strength inside herself she never knew existed. And when the nurse finally placed her son on her chest, Olivia gazed at his tiny, perfect features and felt a love so overwhelming, so powerful, it felt like her entire being was expanding. Hello, my sweet boy, she whispered, as tears of pure joy streamed down her face. I'm your mother. I have been waiting my whole life for you. The baby opened his deep blue eyes and looked right up at her. In that single moment, every horrible thing that had happened over the past year, the betrayal, the loss, the public shame, the fear, it all evaporated into nothing. It had no power over her anymore because this beautiful, perfect little person was in her arms. He was hers, and she was his. That was all that would ever matter. What are you going to name him? The nurse asked softly. Olivia didn't need to think. The name had been a quiet truth in her heart for months. Leo, she said. His name is Leo, for his grandfather. Olivia stayed in the hospital for 2 days. Her room was overflowing with flowers, a stunning arrangement of white peonies from Miss Monroe, a cheerful bouquet from a cousin, and dozens of other arrangements from new friends and board members. There were cards and balloons and impossibly tiny gifts for the baby. There was nothing at all from Ethan. Not a text, not a call, not a word. And Olivia was deeply, profoundly thankful for his silence. When she brought baby Leo home to her Gold Coast brownstone, everything was perfectly ready. The nursery was a vision of understated elegance, with a hand-carved maple crib, soft, oak-colored linens, and a brass mobile of stars and moons turning gently in the afternoon sun. A mobile of geometric shapes turned slowly from the ceiling. Books filled the built-in shelves. A comfortable rocking chair sat by the floor-to-ceiling window, perfectly positioned for Olivia to gaze out at the Seattle skyline while feeding her baby. That first night home from the hospital, Olivia sat in that chair with her son, Marcus Jr., asleep in her arms. The city lights twinkled below, casting a soft glow in the room. You will never have to endure what I did, Olivia whispered to the sleeping infant. You'll never know the sting of betrayal or the chill of abandonment. You will be raised surrounded by honesty and love. You will be wanted. You will always be safe. She gently kissed the top of his head. Your grandfather wanted this for you, she murmured. He built an entire world so that you could have every chance to build your own. And I'm going to honor that gift. I'm going to create something with it. I'm going to make him so proud. The baby let out a tiny sigh in his sleep, his small hand gripping the fabric of her shirt, and Olivia smiled, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. In the months that followed, Olivia dedicated herself to building a meaningful legacy. She established the Marcus Thorne Grant for Innovators, a fund specifically aimed at supporting tech startups founded by single mothers who were rebuilding their lives after personal upheaval. And their children, the trust-funded scholarships, mentorships, housing assistance, and startup grants for single mothers. Eleanor knew the sting of discovering Julian's betrayal, how alone she'd felt, how lost she did not want another woman to feel that same despair. She wanted every woman who had to start over to know that she was not alone, that help existed, that this was just one chapter, not the whole story. The trust became a powerful force. Within 5 years, it had supported over 1,000 families in 4 states. Eleanor was a constant presence at their events, sitting with the women, hearing their struggles, and celebrating their victories. One evening at a gala, a young woman named Sarah came up to her. Sarah was 25, holding a sleeping toddler, and had the determined eyes of a survivor. Mrs. Vance, Sarah, said, her voice thick with emotion, "I just had to thank you when my husband left me. I was lost. I had no degree, no savings. I thought my life was over. I truly did. But someone told me about your trust, and now I have a safe place to live. I'm finishing my nursing degree, and my son is in a wonderful daycare." "You built this from the ashes," Sarah said, squeezing her hand. "You did, Amelia. All I did was hold the blueprint. You're the one who laid every single brick." Amelia didn't just rebuild, she conquered. Working with her father's former partners in sustainable energy, she dove headfirst into the world of green tech and urban development, just as he had always planned for her. Some investments were duds, but the winners were spectacular. Her wealth compounded. She started giving talks, not about betrayal, but about building an empire with integrity. She became a sought-after voice on ethical business and female leadership. She never uttered Mark's name, but the city knew exactly who fueled her fire. "True power," Amelia stated in a now famous interview with a Chicago business journal, "isn't about proving your detractors wrong. It's about becoming so successful that their opinion becomes utterly irrelevant." She was celebrated. Chicago magazines put her on their covers. She earned accolades for her foundation's work in revitalizing neighborhoods. Prestigious universities asked her to inspire their graduates. She became an icon of grace and tenacity. And all the while, little Liam grew up bright, happy, and endlessly curious. On his first birthday, he took his first shaky steps across the polished floor of their enormous Gold Coast penthouse library, and Amelia's cheers were punctuated by joyful tears. He was a radiant child, full of laughter and wide-eyed wonder, constantly pointing at the city's skyline. Amelia made sure Liam knew his grandfather. Every night, she told him stories of how Grandpa Hayes was a brilliant developer, a generous soul who saw potential where others saw decay, and how he adored his grandson before he ever took his first breath. "Your grandfather built things that last, my love," Amelia would whisper to Liam, "and you carry a spirit. That's a legacy to be incredibly proud of." Mark's life took the opposite trajectory. The moment the divorce was final, his carefully constructed world imploded. First, Jenna was gone. She sent a curt 2-sentence text one morning claiming his personal brand had become a liability and she couldn't risk the association. She wished him luck. Mark called her nonstop for 3 days straight. Each call went directly to voicemail. On the 4th day, her number was out of service. Jenna, the ambitious brand strategist, had evaporated from his life as if she'd never been there. His marketing consultancy was next. The few clients who'd stuck around out of some misguided loyalty finally pulled their accounts. They'd all heard the stories. The tale of the marketing guru who was caught drafting a presentation on his 5-year plan with his mistress while his pregnant wife organized their baby shower had ripped through Chicago's business circles. Nobody wanted to be tied to Mark Peterson. He lost his swanky River North office when he missed his 3rd straight lease payment. He sold his Audi to pay off a mountain of credit card debt. He left his sleek condo for a dingy shoebox apartment in a rundown area far from the city center. The place had walls as thin as cardboard, a perpetually rattling air conditioner, and a deep-seated smell of old grease that clung to everything. Mark spent his days firing off resumes and his nights staring at the water stains on the ceiling, sleep a distant memory. No one would touch him. His name was Mud. Any recruiter who Googled him was met with a flood of articles, society page whispers, and thinly veiled takedowns detailing his scandal. He was a professional pariah. Sometimes, in the dead of night, with the sound of his neighbor's television blasting through the wall, Mark would pull out his phone and look at old photos. There was one from their wedding, Amelia gazing at him with a look of such pure adoration it was physically painful to see. There was another from the day she announced she was pregnant, her face absolutely radiant as she held up the little ultrasound picture, her eyes wet with happy tears. He had possessed all of that, a world of love, of loyalty, of genuine happiness, and he had actively, meticulously planned to burn it to the ground. One afternoon, Mark was trudging through the loop on his way to an interview he knew was a dead end when he saw it. A massive digital billboard wrapped around the corner of a skyscraper. It featured a photo of Amelia holding a laughing baby Liam. She looked breathtaking, poised, powerful, and serene. The baby's little hand was reaching for her cheek as she beamed. The text across the image read, "The Hayes Foundation. Building Chicago's future, one family at a time." Mark Peterson stood paralyzed on the crowded sidewalk, the city's cacophony of sirens and honking cabs dissolving into white noise. He stared up at the colossal image of the woman he'd thrown away and the son he'd never known, the bitter burn of tears welling in his eyes. He couldn't escape her. Amelia was Chicago's new darling, her face smiling from magazine racks and TV screens where she championed her charitable work, her aggressive push into renewable energy, and her plans for community revitalization. Every mention was a fresh stab of his own failure. Amelia Hayes secures a $100 million grant for green tech. The Hayes Foundation celebrates its 5th housing project. Innovator of the Year award goes to Amelia Hayes. The headlines were a constant reminder, each photo a fresh torment. A chilling, brutal truth finally broke through the walls of his own narcissism. Amelia had never been simple. She had been profound. She wasn't weak. She was forged from steel. She was never just a part of his life. She had been the entire foundation, and in his breathtaking arrogance, he had taken a sledgehammer to it. And the damage was absolute. The divorce was finalized, his parental rights legally severed by his own hand, the court documents a permanent seal on that chapter. There were no second chances, no back doors, no appeals left to make. Mark Peterson, the man who built brands, was left with nothing but his own ruined name. It was a warm summer night, almost a year after Liam's birth. The vast lawn of the lakefront mansion glowed under the setting sun, the light turning Lake Michigan to shimmering gold. Amelia sat on the terrace in a comfortable chair, watching her son toddle across the grass. Liam was on the move, a tiny, determined adventurer, lurching from a flower bed toward a stray butterfly. A pure, happy giggle escaped his lips. Her sister, Sarah, sat beside her, sipping iced tea. "He has Dad's smile," Sarah said softly. Amelia's own smile widened. "I know. Sometimes when he looks up at the sky just like that, the image of Marcus is so vivid it catches in her throat." They settled into a quiet rhythm, watching baby Theo bat at a stray sunbeam dancing on the hardwood floor. "Your grandmother would be impossibly proud of you," Chloe said softly, "not just for reviving the firm or for all the awards, but for the way you handled yourself, the dignity you maintained when you had every right to just detonate." Ilara rocked the antique cradle with her foot. "Do you know what I see most clearly?" she murmured. "I always go back to that fundraiser at the Gibbs Museum. Standing there on the marble floor, holding a champagne flute and staring at that bracelet on her wrist, feeling the whole world just tilt off its axis. I was so sure my life had ended. I thought I had lost absolutely everything, that I was irrevocably and completely on my own." Chloe slid her hand over Ilara's. "But I was wrong," Ilara continued. "I wasn't on my own. Grandma B was still watching over me. She spent her life building a legacy around me that I never truly understood until then. And the baby?" Her eyes softened, landing on Theo, who who had just managed to grab the sunbeam with a triumphant gurgle. The baby was right here with me, a little secret, a tiny flutter that reminded me I had something to fight for. Ilara paused, her gaze drifting toward the palmetto trees, swaying in the salty breeze. "I used to think Marcus destroyed me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But he didn't. He just stepped out of the blueprint of my life. And that was the most incredible gift he could have ever given me. Not the settlement, not the firm, not any of it. The gift was the vacancy, the space to finally become the woman I was always meant to be without his voice in my ear telling me my designs were too ambitious." Chloe wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Since when did you become a philosopher?" Ilara let out a real deep laugh. "A therapist who charges $300 an hour," she said. "Lots and lots of therapy." Their shared laughter floated on the humid afternoon air, carrying over to the cradle. Theo turned his head at the sound of his mother's voice and gave a wide, gummy smile, kicking his little feet. "Mama!" he cooed, a sound full of contentment. "Mama! Mama!" Ilara rose and lifted him into her arms, pressing her face into his soft neck that smelled of milk and sunshine. "Hello, my little architect," she whispered. "Did you have fun designing a new world?" "World," Theo repeated with profound gravity, patting her cheek with a dimpled hand. "That's right," Ilara said. "A better one. You are so clever, Theo, just like your great-grandmother." She carried him through the house as the setting sun cast long shadows across the piazza. The home was warm, filled with the signs of a life being rebuilt. The main hallway was a tribute. There wasn't a picture of a smiling couple on their wedding day, but there was something far more powerful. A large black and white photograph of her grandmother, Beatrice Vance, young and defiant in a hard hat, standing beside the foundational framework of the first modern building constructed in Charleston's historic district. Ilara paused in front of the portrait, a nightly habit. "Say goodnight to Grandma B," she urged her son. "Goodnight," Theo babbled, waving a tiny fist at the photo. Ilara smiled and continued up the winding staircase to the nursery. She changed him into his pajamas, the ones printed with tiny compasses, and settled into the rocking chair by the tall window to tell him a story. "Once upon a time," Ilara began, "there was a grand old house that dreamed of being strong and beautiful again." Theo burrowed into her shoulder, his breaths already deepening into a peaceful rhythm. He was fast asleep before she finished the first part of the tale. She closed her eyes, rocking in the still room, feeling the steady beat of her son's heart against her own. "I need you to understand this," she whispered into the twilight. "Your great-grandmother loved you before you were even a whisper. She dedicated her life to building things that would last, to make sure you would always have a foundation, always have a home. Everything we have, all of this beauty, is because she refused to let anyone tell her no." She gently kissed his downy hair. "And your father?" she went on, her voice softer still. "Your father made decisions that will be very hard to explain for many years. Maybe someday, when you are much older, we can talk it through. But this is the truth you must hold on to, Theo. Your worth is never determined by someone else. Your value is not measured by another person's failure to appreciate it. You are brilliant. You are beloved. You are more than enough. You always were." She placed Theo into his crib, drawing the light quilt over his small body. The mobile of tiny, hand-carved birds turned slowly in the air above him. Casting delicate shadows across the ceiling, Chloe stood in the doorway and watched him sleep, his chest rising and falling in a gentle cadence, his small hands fisted near his cheek, innocent, perfect, safe. This was Ilara's world now, not some romance novel, not a story where a handsome developer builds a perfect life. This was better. It was real, a story of a woman who restored herself, whose grandmother's strength became her own scaffolding, who discovered a resilience she never knew she possessed, who built something magnificent from the wreckage of a lie. Chloe dimmed the nursery lights and walked down the heart pine hallway to her guest room. She paused by the window, looking out over the walled garden bathed in moonlight. The fountain trickled softly, and the ancient live oak stood like a guardian, its mossy branches reaching for the stars, somewhere out there in a sterile glass apartment overlooking the skyline of Atlanta. Marcus Vance was probably staring at city lights haunted by the life he had, so carelessly demolished. But Chloe knew Allard did not think about Marcus. She hadn't truly wasted a thought on him in a very long time. He was now exactly what her grandmother had once called. He was a rounding error in a budget she'd already finalized. There was no reason to double-check the figures. She knew her bottom line and was already drafting blueprints for a new skyline. Chloe settled into the crisp sheets of her new bed. Pulling the duvet up to her shoulders, she glanced at the tablet on her nightstand, its screen glowing with the architectural render of her first solo project. A pediatric hospital wing beside it sat a framed sonogram, a tiny, perfect profile against the dark screen. It was the most powerful blueprint in the room and the foundation of her entire future. "Thank you," Leo Chloe murmured to the memory of her late mentor. "Thank you for believing in me. I hope I'm doing this right." She placed the tablet back on its charger, turned off the lamp, and closed her eyes. Outside the city hummed a constant, reassuring lullaby of life and traffic, and somewhere below a siren wailed and faded. Chloe Morgan slept deeply. Her unborn son slept deeply within her. They were safe. They were wanted. They were finally free. And that, dear friends, is the beginning of their real story. Remember this. Your soul is not a company that goes bankrupt just because one investor pulls out. Your worth is not a piece of real estate to be devalued by a bidder who couldn't afford it anyway. Sometimes the person who betrays you is unknowingly clearing the path to your greatest success. Sometimes being underestimated is the ultimate strategic advantage because it lets you assemble an empire without anyone watching. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't getting even at all. It is about becoming so successful, so outrageously happy, so profoundly at peace, that the person who broke your trust becomes a forgotten detail in your epic autobiography. Thank you for joining us. If this story connected with you, please hit that like button, subscribe for more, and send this to anyone who needs to hear it today. Let us know in the comments how you would have handled Marcus's betrayal. We love hearing your thoughts. Until the next chapter, live well and never forget that you are the architect of your own destiny. This story was meticulously conceived, written, and refined by our in-house team to deliver empowering narratives and real-world wisdom. Thank you for being a vital part of our audience.